Hello and welcome everyone to our first panel of today's session for the conference. This panel is titled Games, Post-Colonialism and India. I am Shovik Kaur and I will be chairing this session. I am delighted to say that we have with us several very interesting presentations lined up, and we hope to have a fruitful and fascinating discussion. I will request the audience to kindly keep their microphone and camera switched off for the duration of these presentations. Please use the chat box for posting your comments and questions, which we shall take up in the Q&A session at the end of this panel after all papers have been presented. A reminder to the participants, you have 20 minutes for your individual presentations. I will have to unfortunately interrupt you once you go over the 20-minute mark. So let's begin. Our first paper for this session is Abhirup Maity's Alternative History from the Lens of Video Games, Colonial India, and Mahatma Gandhi. Abhirup Maity is an MPhil research scholar at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, India. His research theme pertains to exploring lesser-known connections between M.K. Gandhi and games. He holds bachelor and master's degree in history from Presidency University, Kolkata, India. Over to you, Abhirup.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Would you like to share your screen or would you like to share a presentation?
On the video.
Yes. I have given you video privileges. You can start your video now if you want to.
Okay. While working on the thesis, exploring unknown Gandhi, a connection between M.K. Gandhi and games under Dr. Shobik Mukherjee, as I went deeper into the theme, certain things surprised me. And I was stuck in a very strange question. That is how India's most globalized icon, Mahatma Gandhi, was represented in video games. Reading Dr. Mukherjee's book, Video Games and Post-Colonialism, Empire Plays Back, gave me an idea to look this question from the perspective of game studies. On the other hand, my discipline on which I am rooted and trained is history, gave me a different prism. Integrating both the prism of literature and history, I have tried to answer this question from an interdisciplinary angle. So let me begin my presentation with introducing the conceptual tools like alternative history, counterfactual history, and future narrative to explain the misrepresentation of colonial India and Mahatma Gandhi in video games. From 1960s onwards, alternate history gains popularity among scholars based on fundamental questions. What if the tales of history? Some of the very popular examples are Philip Dick's classic A Man in the High Castle, in which Nazi Germany and Japan are victorious in the World War II. Since Allies forces are defeated, therefore America is divided and colonized by Germany. Stephen King's novel 11/23/63 is which a teacher travels back in the time to prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Novelist Stephen H. Seaver argues an alternate history requires three conditions. First, a point of divergence from the historical record before the time in which the author is writing. Second, a change that would alter the known history and an examination of the ramification of that alteration to history. Historian Neil Ferguson popularized the concept of counterfactual history, which is closely related to the ideas of alternative history. British historian Jeremy Black argued as a method of historical research, counterfactual history explores historical events with an extrapolated timeline in which key historical events either did not occur or had an outcome different from the historical record. The historical record we know. Another intertwined concept is future narrative, underlined by the historian Kathleen Singles in her book Alternative History, Playing with Contingency and Necessity. One important feature of future narrative is the future time, namely it is yet undecided, open, and not yet crystallized into actuality. There is an existing confusion that is, while defining an event from the prism of future narrative, it is sometimes coincided with the perception of alternate history. Alternate history has two basic characteristics which future narrative does not have. First, the narrative of alternate histories consists entirely of events. An event has happened and one is definite outcome, while the future narrative consists of multiple outcomes. Now I'll focus on the misrepresentation of video games in how it connected to the idea of alternate history based on three games: Age of Empire, Empire Total, and Sid Meier's Civilization. All these games have similar fundamental features. All are important. All are empire building games, and as the process of colonialism is depicted, the central feature of these games is it gives players the chance to replay the colonial history. This is to know. This game gives liberty either to go with the existing dominating narrative of colonialism based on actual historical event. For example, someone is playing as England. In the game, the player has to colonize rest of the existing polity, or the player can choose to play the reversal of the colonial history by altering the characters. More elaborately, I would like to explain this. Historically, India was colonized by Europeans. These empire building games give players the option to choose India as their country and colonize Europe. Here, the process of colonialism remains absolutely same, while the character in history alters. This is an example of alternative history, where the fundamental events remain the same while the protagonist alters. This also brings up an interesting question: how games treated colonial history or represented the process of colonialism? The answer is distortion of history to a large extent. There are multiple ways to distort history. Scholars' observations suggest two ways followed here, that is, oversimplification and selective amnesia. In the Age of Empire 3, this game features Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 in its early mission. It offers an oversimplified version of Indian history, that is, exploitation of resources as the consequences of revolt. This is quite similar to the other countries in the game. The game largely overlooked the inner complex dynamics, the role of societal norms, and polity and religion behind the revolt of 1857 as historian offer. Not only in the context of India, this game represented a simplified version of history of the other African and South American countries too. James Mill, through his work History of India, placed India at the lower strata of civilizational structure. The game Age of Empire 2 represents India in a stereotypical way, which can be seen as a continuation of a Mill's theory. Here, the player gets an advantage if he chooses the European nation over India or Africa. Actually, the Age of Empire 2 is an empire building game. As the game progresses, the level upgrades with the development of cavalry, expansion of trade market, handling of protest and other infrastructure simultaneously. If someone chooses European nation, he will get a strong military regiment in compared to choosing India or Africa. The game will progress quickly over choosing European nation over India or Africa. This is a crucial example how India is represented on similar colonialist narrative even in the video games too. The second aspect is the selective amnesia. It remains quite popular weapon to distort history. In the context of another game, Battlefield Vietnam, Vietnamese grievance against French remain unknown in the historical setting, while in actual history, France colonized Vietnam. One of the criticism that the game offered was it can only be playable as Americans, where the local Vietnamese projected as a guerrilla warfare who needed to be defeated to win the game. Such setting of game is not only limited to the entertainment, there is an application and process of narrative working through a soft power here. The game Empire Total War have misrepresented India on a multiple contexts. In the game, India is depicted as a kingdom ruled by Maratha around 1730s. Historically, this representation is incorrect. At that point of time, Mughal was on the driving seat. The same game portrays tea plantation in 1700, while the actual historical record suggests mid-19th century was the time of tea plantation in India. It is interesting to note that this game replaced indigo with a tea plantation, as indigo plantation have a history of anti-colonial struggle led by Gandhi attached to it. Therefore, it might deliberately be omitted. In all this game, dark histories of colonialists are whitewashed and presented in a romanticized form, while the stereotypical representation of colonialism is repeated. As historian Esther Bloch in his book, still repeated. Okay, so I'd like to mention one point. This game too depicts all the religion in the context of India's Hindus, which is incorrect. As historian Esther Bloch in the book The Colonial Construction of Hinduism argued Hindus as a colonial construct. Setting up the Hindu as a dominating religion have a deep historical underpinning. That is, during the colonial rule, British carried out the census for categorizing demography. When the colonial sociologists failed to fit anyone in the sect or failed to fit anyone or any sect under the group of their assumed category, they tagged him and their sect as a by default Hindu. The stereotypical representation of religion is practiced in this game too. The empire-building games ignores heterogeneity of the colonized nations and represent them as a homogeneous entity. Now I'll explain how Mahatma Gandhi was misrepresented. Before this, I thought of sharing some unknown information about Gandhi's connection with games unknown to many of you. Journalist Harris Bush met one of the MK Gandhi's classmate Ratilal Gelbani Mehta of Alfred High School, Rajkot. In an interview, this man remembered Gandhi as a dashing cricketer who to have a keen interest in the game as a school student. One of the rarest known incident of Gandhi's in South Africa is that is during the South African War, Gandhi rose and raised an Indian ambulance where he received a war medal too. Gandhi criticized the idea of leisure too, and games are part of leisure. Here, Gandhi to become a part of Gandhi criticized the idea of leisure, and in video games, Gandhi to become a part of it. Just like irrespective of having a strong aversion towards the materialism, Gandhi featured in every Indian currency notes. Luke Plunkett points out Gandhi's in the game Civilization is represented not as a peaceful, non-violent character, but for his radical, aggressive nature, where he is popular for dropping nuclear bombs. The original game gave Gandhi this trait because of a technical glitch. Gandhi was given a lowest aggression rating, that is a score of 1, in the aggression parameter, so that he would rarely declare war on someone. However, if the player chooses a democratic government, the aggression score dropped by 2, and Gandhi went down to -1. Since the game was unable to place negative values, it gave Gandhi the next value that he recognized. However, the next version of this game, this particular aspect of Gandhi remained unchanged. This misrepresentation is a large-scale distortion itself for multiple reasons. Firstly, Gandhi was philosophically against the concept of war. India through Gandhi has contributed to the world the weapon of peace and non-violent struggle against the colonial empire. In other words, India has cultivated the golden virtues of non-violence and humanity. While this misrepresentation in the game deliberately denied India's and Gandhi's contribution to the world history. This is a reimagining of a history of a very different kind. Secondly, Gandhi's writing in Hind Swaraj suggests he was against the concept of empire, as a famous phrase, English rule without Englishmen. Thirdly, Gandhi criticized the idea of Western civilization on the multiple ground, which I'm not going to discuss as this will divert the theme. Placing a man who has had a strong aversion to a civilization in the game named civilization is itself a distortion of a Gandhian ideas. There is another empire building game called colonization, which is a bit different. Here, the player have to liberate motherland from the shackles of colonialism, irrespective of its historical reality. Actually, in this game, every country or character is depicted as colonized. As the player, one have to lead an anti-colonial struggle to win the game. Interesting part here is, suppose the player chooses country India, then he or she will have to fight against the colonialism, which is actually true in the historical setting. And suppose if player with India wins, then it's not an alternate history anymore. If the player loses, then it still remains a colony, thus it is an alternate history. On the other hand, if a player chooses England and fight against colonialism, then it's a different representation of a history. Now I'd like to discuss what does playing as alternative history offers the readers or players. In short, it gives player to reshuffle the burden of being colonized into a temporal and imaginative space by invoking the traumas of colonialism. This is to note that all games which I have discussed in the presentation are European games. I am sure different stories and different perspective can be found if I look over the Indian games. So here I end my presentation.
Right. Thank you, Abhirup. Thank you for that lovely presentation. Okay. So our second paper for this session is Anandadeep Roy's The Game as Interpretation, Identity, Absurdity, and the Horror of Colonialism in Disco Elysium. If you could just please mute yourself, Abhirup, because I think there's some sort of an interference. Yes, that's good. Right. Thank you. Anandadeep Roy, him, is an editor working out of Delhi. He completed his postgraduate degree in English from Jadavpur University in 2018. He is passionate about indie games and speculative fiction and is the happiest when the two get combined. Over to you now, Anandadeep.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Amazing. I'll just share my screen then.
Yes.
Yeah, can you see it?
Yes, it's visible. Please go on.
Amazing. Okay. So the title of my paper is The Game as Interpretation, Identity, Absurdity, and the Horror of Colonialism in DiGRA edition. So to first of all, thank you, DiGRA India, for giving me the opportunity to present here, and good afternoon to everybody here. And spoilers ahead, just a clear discussion that there are going to be spoilers, and this is a game that I would not like to spoil for anyone, but I have to, it's a necessary evil. So to analyze DiGRA Elysium and its ludic enterprise, I feel that I must approach it from two angles. The first, from the point of view of the game mechanics and its role in the game, and the second is from the angle of the narrative that the game is presenting. So there are basically three mechanics here. Outcomes in DiGRA Elysium depend on three things. The first is chance. Every outcome is determined by the roll of 2 die to pass a skill check. The second is how the player chooses skills and abilities to influence the roll of the die, adding to the number to make passing a skill check easier. However, passing a skill check is not necessary to succeed in an endeavor. Failing a skill check opens up its own narrative direction the player is then compelled to follow. There is a death mechanic in the game, but it is narratively integrated in the sense your death is always depicted as the result of an aspect of your character. Your death is often the result of chance and failing a skill check, and you're often left with the feeling that there is little you could have done to prevent the death. Now, what I would like to point out here is the humor and the absurdity of these deaths. So all of these are due to a certain action you take in the game. For example, if you run out of money, you're forced to sleep in a trash can, and that is considered a death. Or you drink a bottle of pure alcohol and set yourself on fire. These are extremely absurd and often comical deaths. And this absurdity is something that I would like you to keep in mind as we go on. Like a detective, the player is a discoverer and interpreter of science. There is very little action in the sense that there is very little you can do to change the world around you. The only thing you have actual control over is the detective himself and how the detective reacts to situations and what kind of a person he is. Herein lies the function of the game as an game of identity formation. There are 4 markers of identity formation that impact the game. Each is a mechanical aspect of the game. So the first is your skills, which function like attributes in a conventional RPG. Taking a cue from D&D, RPGs usually have attributes like strength, agility, body, charisma, intelligence, willpower. They're related to your ability and give you certain advantages in certain skill check. Now, DiGRA Elysium departs from this in creating this huge array of skill check. There are 4 general areas like intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics, but each of these skills are unique in their own way and they help you do certain things. For instance, if you see her, encyclopedia is a knowledge of the world, while electrochemistry is about, well, for lack of a better word, taking drugs. And perception is about how you can see the world, while conceptualization up here is about how you're conceiving of the world. So the skill mechanic is central to the game because it determines the type of game you will play. The game can be played in multiple ways depending on the type of character you're choosing to create. This may be similar to how a conventional RPG is played, but in DiGRA Elysium, your choice has concrete narrative, your skills enabling you to access certain aspects while denying you access to other ways and means. For instance, your proficiency in electrochemistry might enable you to solve a problem in a certain way, while if you have proficiency in, say, hand-eye coordination, you do something else to solve the same problem. And each of these is a narrative track, and you can do it one way or you can do it the other, and they often have radically different outcomes. So your skills determine how you see the world. More importantly, and this is very unique and very interesting, your skills have voices and opinions of their own. They also have their own political alignments. So say while electrochemistry keeps on trying to get you to do drugs and smoke cigarettes, Shivers, which is right beside electrochemistry, keeps on saying mysterious things about the city to you. Which skill you choose to listen to and choose to follow in invest points in determines who you are in this game. And this is the first level of identity formation. The second is the thought cabinet. And this is a reflection of the thought you're having. And it is as absurd as the death mechanic and the skill set that I mentioned earlier. So for instance, if you, I don't know if you can see it, but say there is the inexplicable feminist agenda, where you basically mint yourself as a feminist, or say there is righteous self-critique, where it's basically a gateway into you being a sorry cop, which we will come to later. But the attributes are how you choose to play the game, and the thought cabinet is an approximation of why your character is choosing to make the choices that he is making, or why you are playing the game the way you are playing it. It acts as a kind of narrative account book of how, as you're progressing to the game, of your character. So the thought system is directly related to the political alignment that your character chooses to follow. Each political alignment, you can choose 4, I one of the 4, and has its own quest line within the game. It's a sub quest, but the end of it has no impact on the larger game, and it is equally absurd because it all centers on a statue which you decorate in various ways depending on your political alignment after a very convoluted quest line which does not make much sense. And if you can read what is on the screen here, you will realize that the way these political alignments are described are also absurd and extremely exaggerated and caricaturized to no end. There is no sense of balance or control. It is the extreme of what you might think, and that extreme makes it hilarious. In the sense, say you are a fascist, so the way the dialogue of the fascism tree is written is it depicts fascism as an absurd opportunity, but the same holds true for all political. It's not just fascism that is satirized, but communism, fascism, moralism, which is their equivalent for our neoliberalism, and ultraliberalism, which is just free market capitalism. It's, as you can see, first, if you have a side bitch ideology cooking somewhere, don't sweat it. Fighting indirect taxation for the Gossamer state is compatible with all creeds. It's amazing. So the thought system and the dialogue you choose is also linked to your copotype, the kind of police officer you choose to be. You can choose to be a sorry cop, you can choose to be a boring cop, you can choose to be a fancy cop. Again, extremely humorous the way. It is a game that talks about very serious issues with a very light tone. So in both the political system, alignment system, as well as the copotype, these are the few things that you as a player can control with your dialogue choices, your skill choices, and your thought choices. Your attributes do have an impact on the gameplay, but it does not impact the overarching story or the political narrative of the game or the landscape of the game in any significant way. However, it does impact your experience of the character and the world. And herein lies my argument that Disco Elysium is not a detective game. It is a game of investigation and discovery. But what the player is discovering is the detective and the game world much more than the murder. The game is also one of the creation of an identity. What is your political alignment? Which part of your fractured identity are you listening to? All these determine your character, and your character determines what aspects of the world you're able to uncover or relate to. The part of the virtual world or your interpretation of the virtual world through your choice of dialogue that you can uncover or understand is what you as a player have approached to. So the second approach that I will present is that of the narrative of the game and the lore of the game. There are essentially 3 stories. First is the murder mystery. A man has been killed and you are the police officer who is assigned to solve the murder. Who killed the victim and why? The second story is your story as a protagonist, because you have woken up without any memory of who you are. So who are you? It is a game of discovery of the self, or rather it is a game of creation of the self. And the third story, and I might argue this is the most important of the all and the one where you don't have any agency, is a story of the history of the world and the individuals inhabiting that world. In the sense, what is this place? So the first story is a murder mystery. You are a detective who has lost his memories and whose identity is fractured. As I said, in the skill system, all your identities are spread out and each talks to each other. They talk to each other, they talk to you. It is a completely crazy show. As mentioned before, aspects of your mind constantly speak to each other, and it is up to you to choose what kind of a detective will you play. Given that it is an RPG, you expect to have some impact on the world you're living. You are, after all, the protagonist and the player. Indeed, the game sets up an elaborate historical background as well as major political conflict that is on the horizon. So the political conflict is essentially that a man has been hanged, and it is ostensibly by this socialist union, which is striking against a corporate entity. Now, the corporate entity has sent in contractors or mercenaries to put down the revolution, so to speak. But the murder of a mercenary is being treated as the spark that would light a fire, a class struggle, if you will. Now, it is elaborately made clear to you, or it appears to be made clear to you, that your solving this murder will determine whether or not this class struggle takes place. Now, through the dialogue with the major characters, you are made aware that you may have a pivotal role in the conflict. You are given that your choices may impact the ultimate outcome of this political conflict. However, at the end, it is revealed that you can have no role to play in the larger story of revolution. You're limited to your role as the detective, and your function as a player is limited by that role. So even if there are massive injustices taking place, and even if there are things that you would like to change in the district, the game makes certain that you are aware that your actions have no impact on the larger picture of the political and historical landscape. But that does not mean you don't get to discover it. You know all of it. You just can't do anything about it. The system operates without you and on you. And even if you're given the illusion of agency, it is made clear that you cannot change it. This in itself is an ideological choice. By reducing the player's impact on the story, the game raises questions about the role of the player. What is the player doing? What is the role of the player in this world? The second story is the actual story that the player is playing, because that is the only story where you have an imagination. So the second story is the identity crisis. The story you play, who they're playing, and how that character is choosing to interpret themselves and the world they're inhabiting. The story you play is created through the interplay of these three stories. Thus, the detective story, the story of the world, and the story of the murder are united here in the person of the detective. And that is the person of the detective in his underwear, waking up after a night of heavy drinking. So, the futility of choice brings in the aspect of the absurd to the gameplay. Two aspects of the absurd are important to the gameplay in Disco Elysium. The first we have already discussed is utility. The detective uncovers the mystery, and the detective uncovers his own identity. His political choices and his corporate life have little to do with the larger events that are shaping the world. He's a protagonist, but only in his own little story. The story of the world and history plays around him without him being able to contribute in any significant way. There are instances in the game where the detective does act on the world, but these are impermanent and often not impactful in any meaningful way. But then the game raises the question, why does the protagonist in an RPG need to change the world? Why does he need to be the hero who saves communism or capitalism? The futility of the actions of the detective are encapsulated in one of the most moving scenes in the game, which is this one. So this is written in red ink and petrol, and the detective sets fire to it. And so in French, it means one day I will return to your side. And that has a profound poetic impact at the end of the game. I would argue, in fact, this is the denouement of the game. And what do you do with that denouement? You set fire to it and it disappears. And that, I think, encapsulates the entire ethos of the game as your actions being like dust in the wind, like the poetic moment just disappearing into the air, into thin air. So the second aspect of the absurd that I would like to point out is the humor in the writing of the game. So all these choices that you make to determine your character, creating a person who is a caricature of an individual, and yet it strangely makes sense. The person is powerless insofar as they're unable to change the world in any significant way. They're unable to act and have any impact on the story, because having an impact will not change the story, but merely how the player sees the story. In this, the character is reduced to being the epitome of the absurd. Your reactions as a player is what creates the humor in the game. This is apparent in the political system that I show and the corpo type, and it permeates the game. It is also apparent in the skill tree and the dialogues. So the world you inhabit as a detective is a colonized world. The world has seen considerable violence. Yeah. So the world has seen considerable violence, and the possibility is the violence ended. With colonization by the coalition and the Moralist International, Revachol, the place you're inhabiting, has begun to lose its own identity, and Martin is a testament. This place is a testament to the fractured nature of its inhabitants. So it's not clear here, but because this is Martin is in the past. So these buildings are shattered. The Ferris wheel is no longer there. Everything is in disrepair. The country we see has no political agency and is essentially ruled by a centrist foreign government that is designed to extract every bit of its value. As is mentioned in the game, Revachol is a captive market. The detective lives in a world where his actions don't make a difference. The game goes further to show that the implicable nature of the system has no alternative because all individuals remain without agency. Consider the socialist workers' paradise. That is shown in the game, and it is shown it is essentially a way for the Clare brothers to make money for themselves. The system that you inhabit as a detective is not ahistoric. For every era of history that you go through in the game that you learn about, there was a dream, a tiniest possibility of utopia, the ideal. However, the game shows that the dream was exactly what it was, a dream. Because the systems, by virtue of them being systems, you do nothing but dehumanize you. You cannot do anything against these systems that have impact. The reactions that you have as a detective, the fracturing of your identity, the inevitability of the outcome of your actions, and the absurdity of your characterization is a legitimate reaction to the betrayal of the historic dream, not once, but repeatedly. Martinez and the detective are both haunted by possibility, and the only reaction is using the fragments of your identity to recreate yourself in the way you want. So the horror of colonization is what informs the detective as an individual. In the totalizing system, he has not political agency, thus all political acts for him are acts of absurdism that are devoid of any real meaning as they're devoid of any impact. The only thing the player can do in face of such inevitability is to just bear it and have an irrational response to it because of lack of agency. Laughter and the irrational are the only rational response where your action no longer has significant meaning. So an interesting point here that I would like to point out, which I've not put on the slide, but in the game, Revachol is haunted by its past and the detective is haunted by his past, in the sense that he had a fiance who left him, and in a dream he conflates Dolores Day, the person who is the founder of the system that is occupying Revachol at the moment, and his lover or his ex-lover into one individual being. And so this conflation is an interesting point of colonialism of the and how his own past trauma haunts him. So trauma, colonialism, circle, so to speak. So to conclude, I would like to raise a question about my analysis of absurdism. Is Disco Elysium then thus just waiting for Godot in the form of a game where two men do nothing and whose actions have no meaning? I would argue that Disco Elysium, while it does illustrate the absurdity of totalizing system, is a more nuanced game than that. Both its narrative and its mechanisms point to a more hopeful interpretation. The detective's ambit of action is not impactful to the great historical forces that he labors under, but it is impactful to the individuals that he interacts with. Consider the church. So in the game, the detective interacts with these group of young people and helps them set up a drug lab and a church and a dance studio in a church. And in one of another extremely moving scene, the detective has to inform a woman whose husband was found dead of the person's death. And again, that is an extremely emotional scene and extremely impactful and very serious. And that is not treated with any humor at all. So at the level of the individual, often the humor is replaced by a deep melancholy and a very empathetic understanding of individuals, which I don't see in many games. So Disco Elysium at the end is not about the great or the historical. At its core, I feel Discollusion is a game about living life and creating an identity for yourself within the ambit of that life. It is a game of interpretation, understanding the world in yourself. The game is about choice. It does not force you to redeem yourself or even be a good cop. The game goes out of its way to show that the choices you make matter, not to the great historical forces, but to you as an individual living in the world. I recall that incident about Gart and Sylvie, where Gart is the cafeteria manager and Sylvie is the person he has a crush on, and you sort of bring them back together. You can choose to and you cannot choose to, and it does not have any massive consequence other than the fact that somebody looks at you slightly differently. At the very end of the game, Kim, your partner, who I have not mentioned, and there's reasons for that. Kim, your partner, evaluates your action in the game, where he lists out your many sins or good deeds as if reading from a scorecard. This is the game, the impact of your actions on yourself and the people around you. Thank you. That's all I have to put. See.
Right. Thank you very much, Anandadeep. Our third and final paper for this session is Geoffrey Fernandez's A Critical Study of Problematic Historical Narratives in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Geoffrey Fernandez is a PhD candidate at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani. His doctoral research examines the use of culture, mythology, and folklore in video games. He is also a founding member of DiGRA India. Over to you now, Geoffrey.
Well, thank you, sure. I will try to share my screen. Please let me know.
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible. Go on.
Okay. First of all, welcome everyone. So today I want to talk about, this is a case study of problematic historical narratives, and the game I'm going to analyze is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This is still a work in progress, so the purpose of this presentation is basically to talk about my initial observations on this, and maybe discuss the future scope of this study. So, and first of all, works that deal with Assassin's Creed and history and representation. This is not an entirely new field. There have been works by people like Komil, Adrian Shaw, our very own Shorik Mukherjee, and even Emil Haman on Assassin's Creed specifically. So based on some points that are mentioned here, this was what helped me base my study. So I would like to move on to the theory behind this. Now I understand that, we are a little running behind schedule, and we have had a wonderful sort of talk by our keynote presenters, both Poonam and Zara, and they have almost covered up what I really wanted to share about representation and identity. So that saves us a bit of time, and I will just add a few points to it, which are crucial to help understand what I'm going to be talking about. So the first thing is that fictional cultural expressions, such as entertainment media, which in our case would be like video games, as well as allegedly factual ones, such as historiographic documentaries, are often representations of the past, as in they are what the narrator chooses to show people, not necessarily what actually has happened. And Chapman, for example, talks about this exact phenomena by saying that an image of the past is therefore dependent on the articulation of certain selected variables and the exclusion of possible alternatives. And he also adds that this is exemplified in the case of historical game development, where multiple pressures and aims decide what does and does not go into a game, which in turn determine the opportunities for meaning making and discovery offered to the players. I would request all of you to please keep this particular point in mind, because this is the entire basis of what is going to come next. And why is this important? It's as White puts it, that narrative and discourse serve as constitutive elements of history. And it is to these that individuals and collectives form their understanding of the past. So what this basically says is that and especially keeping in mind that video games are a really popular form of media. So what's depicted in them is exactly how people would perceive certain histories and cultures to be. So hence representation in these kind of forms of media becomes very important to how certain people would think about these cultures. And I would like to also quote Emil Hamann on this, because he puts it very well when he says that considering both their prominence as mass entertainment and their hegemonic articulations, it is therefore important to investigate how digital games construct, disseminate, and reinforce processes of cultural memory through their own medium-specific features. At this point, I would also like to add that since these constructions are, well, and I call them constructions again, because I want to reiterate the point that this might not be actual history. It's just how it's being portrayed. So I just got the message that my presentation is visible now. Was it visible?
Yes, it was visible.
Okay. All right. So yeah. So what I want to reiterate again is that these are sorry. So this is these constructions, right? They are constructed in the present, and these are constructions about the past. So the real world problems of the present and the hegemonic relationships, power relationships that exist now will also influence how a past is demonstrated and hence perceived by people. So, move on to the next slide. So since we're talking about hegemonic perceptions, let's talk about how Norse culture, which is the primary, say the point, which is the kind of culture that's depicted in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So I would like to talk about what is the current perception of such kind of culture in our real world. So, well, first of all, most of the documented history about Vikings it comes from mainly Christian sources, because this was one of the dark ages. So not much is there about it. And we have to keep in mind that those periods were mainly the Norse invading England, basically. So of course, they are not going to favorably depict the Norse. So, and given that Christianity has had a hegemonic relationship when it comes to, well, talking about history as such. So the point I made about how those relationships affect the past, this is one of the examples why certain perceptions of Vikings in the modern age are problematic. Then the next point to note is that the Norse gods, for example, well, Norse culture is not entirely a scholastic subject, but when people have tried to study it, they have tried to compare it to, say, like Greek culture, for example. And Greek culture has a very coherent canon of their gods and their stories and myths. So the same model has been tried to apply on Norse culture as such, and that does not translate well. We can see this, for example, the Norse gods like, say, Odin, Tyr, and Thor, of course. They are put together like in a sort of pantheon of gods, just similar to what Greek gods are depicted as. But that's usually not the case. Like, for example, Zeus is at the head of the table, and then there are gods who are subordinates. Similarly, Odin is shown in that simple way. So that's the kind of perception people get. And especially since we're talking about Thor, we have got representations in movies like Marvel, for example, of them being certain heroic characters, having heroic characteristics or being like in certain ways. But when we talk about the actual sources of Norse culture, that would be mainly, say, the Prose Edda or the Poetic Edda. Over there, the gods are mostly depicted as having human-like characteristics, where they are not above, say, deceit and other kind of features, unfavorable features, if we would like to call them, of human nature. So these are some kind of other perceptions. And of course, we all have, like, this is one of another big stereotype that, well, Vikings are supposed to be huge warriors who are not very smart, or like do not have culture of their own. They're just brutes, and well, all they do is pillage places and, well, just create terror. But from the archaeological and historical sources that have been uncovered so far, we can realize that, well, they were a culture and they had sophistication in their ways too. It's not like how they have been depicted by Christian sources to be dumb brutes. So that's one other thing. Apart from that, well, for example, and one other thing is like when we talk about Vikings, the first thing that comes to mind is a helmet with horns, because that's the image that's been portrayed so far. But to tell you the truth, well, that there's no evidence that supports that, historical evidence. In fact, that was just a kind of a costume idea that was applied in Wagnerian opera mainly. So that's how that myth has taken place. So these were some of the basic hegemonic perceptions that are prevalent right now. So, well, just to, again, this is a short interlude to explain what Assassin's Creed Valhalla is about. In 1873 AD, political pressures in Norway prompt Eva, that's the main character, and her adoptive older brother Sigurd to leave their clan in Norway and come to English lands as a part of the Viking expansion. So basically, the game sets the whole background in, say, the Great Heathen expansion, the Great Heathen War, and so it's basically set in that. The clan comes in. That's Eva's clan, comes in conflict with the kingdoms of, say, Wessex, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, which again is also includes the legendary king, so Great Alfred the Great. So they are like real historical characters also involved in the setting. And it also takes borrows from, say, Norse mythology and puts us through, well, the lands that are considered realms. So two of the realms of the 9 realms that are considered in Norse mythology, that's Asgard and Jotunheim, are also present in dreamlike sequences. Okay, so I started this study mainly as a way to look at counter-hegemonic representations, because the game, while credit where it's due, does have these kind of elements to it, where it tries to offset these kind of stereotypes that are present. So let's talk a bit about that first. So what Valhalla gets right? Well, Norse religion embodies a constant search of honor and reputation through battle. And that's shown as plenty in Valhalla, because every character talks about dying an honorable death or dying in battle, and basically makes your player promise them that if anytime they are, say, in a situation where they might not be able to do that, to maybe, say, kill them, or to make sure that they reach to Valhalla, or that's basically Norse heaven. So that's there quite plenty in the game. Apart from that, the game has tried to show the various cultural pastimes of the Vikings in that age. For example, fighting is something that can be called as, well, historical rap battles. And that's how even Ubisoft has tried to present this, where people respond to each other in the form of jibes, but they are rhyming. And Olog is a game where played with stones. That's basically like something you can say, like, for example, India has Ludo, and other cultures have different games. So was the one that's there for them. It's just cute. It's something like what you can relate to how Gwent was a part of Witcher. That it's a side thing that you can obviously spend a lot of time on if you want to, and ignore the core story. That's up to the player. But by adding these kind of the elements to it, it tries to show that the culture is more diverse. And especially fighting is important in the game because it unlocks a charisma level, which allows you to have different conversation options with many players. And these conversation options usually end up with players trying to comment that Eivor is quite the poet, and the other kind of so it makes it more diverse than what the story would otherwise be. So that's there. Apart from that, Valhalla also takes inspiration from, say, surviving Viking age art, and tattoos are a very important part of these kind of arts, and players do have the option to, say, equip Eivor with these kind of tattoos. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that these kind of tattoos are, they have been appropriated by a lot of white supremacy movements and Nazi movements too. So Ubisoft has to be commended because it takes special pains to ignore those kind of specific tattoos that have been always associated with that. And instead, they rather base their tattoo designs on what has been chronicled by the traveler Ibn Fadlan. So there's some historicity to this. And how can we not talk about the female character while that who's the protagonist? While of course Ubisoft offers an option where you can choose a male or a female character, there's also an option where it lets the animus, that's the machine that's giving you this whole simulation, choose what character to show on the basis of which memory is stronger. Now, that is an important part, which I'll just come to. Apart, because, well, the in-game explanation for why this happens is mainly because if ever, there is a, there will be spoilers involved in this, but the first explanation that's given to us initially is that the data in the animus is corrupted. But at the same time, there is a concept called ergi in Norse mythology. So that, while is translated exactly as unmanly, it's often used to denote the times that gender roles have been turned on their head. Now, Ubisoft also has, through the medium of the story, explained why sometimes the main character identifies themselves as male at the same time as well as female. So, and that is based on the story of reincarnation and other things that, well, as this is still an initial study that I will need to look into further. But at the same time, I would like to applaud Ubisoft for that kind of move, because it does bring into discussion, brings the discussion about gender queers and gender fluidity into this, especially, and also the sort of magic that Odin is said to have practiced in, the Proceda and these other sources is mainly considered feminine, because it's like, it's future telling basically, and that's considered feminine magic. So these kind of factors have led to a lot of scholars to also discuss the fact that maybe Odin and Loki can be genderqueer. So there's evidence that supports that in this historical text. So Ubisoft has used both a game mechanic as well as actual historical facts to do some take this and represent these kind of features. So that's a good decision. And also in the clan that the player belongs to, when they settle in England, their village, you can basically call it, is filled with a lot of diverse races, and there is some historicity behind that too, because Viking trade routes took them through like numerous cultures, like the Jewish Khazars, Turkish people, North Africans, and even the Abbasid Caliphate, which is again important because in the story, two of the only assassins in the game, to be honest, are from the Middle East, and they have come on the purpose of trade to this village. So that sets plans in motions. However, that being said, certain elements of Norse culture were deemed too violent or counterproductive to this environment of inclusiveness and non-violence that the game tries to show. Now, this might be due to many marketing decisions or other concerns, and especially it has been well documented that Ubisoft has gone through a lot of controversies basically during this time about representation in all, especially since the lead director was also forced to leave due to complications. So keeping all that in mind, certain steps have been taken, and that's where the problems start. So first, I would like to talk about my concerns on the sanitization of history that takes place in this game. For example, there is the removal of slavery. Now, slave trading basically was a very important part of the Scandinavian economy back in 1865, where the game is set. And the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon chronicles calls a great Heathen army turned into a war of conquest. So that's when, you can say the Norse and the Danes who are invading England, they overran these kingdoms, say for Wessex, where Alfred the Great, who is shown as an antagonist in this game, he was the main source that was fighting this invasion. So they basically overran the kingdom and they subjugated the population, taking the best farmlands from its former owners and generally wrecking the place in process. And historical sources are very clear that this was not a particularly pleasant process for the existing population. And it's also important to note, here that due to this kind of invasion, the kingdom of, well, Wessex responded to it with like a series of reforms that radically militarized the kingdom. So when we take about the representation of slavery in Valhalla, it's something, the elements of slavery are not mentioned at all. In fact, slavery is presented more or less as something only the initial Norse, well, bad guy does, and then it's never mentioned again after that. And this is especially surprising because Ubisoft has worked on a game before, that is Assassin's Creed Black Flag, as well as, well, Freedom Cry and Liberation, and more specifically Freedom Cry. And they have, it's set in the Caribbean, and they did acknowledge the presence of slavery quite explicitly. So it's a bit confusing why now they have decided not to go for it. And again, since this whole aspect of slavery does not exist in the game, we then, so then the militarization of England that's somehow still depicted in the game doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, the way it looks, it looks in the game is that Eivor and their clan have come to new lands for a new start, and they're very respectful to the, well, citizens around there, which again I'll come to, is historically not true when it comes to the case of, well, Vikings. And the English reforms, the English Saxons basically appear as antagonists who are non-tolerating, who are hegemonic in nature, who don't want these kind of things. So it puts them in a sort of a bad light without, talking about the actual context, which would then make sense why these factions are against each other. So that's one aspect of sanitization. Well, also the same thing is that the Saxon rulers who are friendly with the Norse, because it's not that everyone has opposed them, they are unfortunately portrayed as unmanly and are shown as damsels in distress, where a lot of the times the Norse culture basically, the Norse people basically have to save them from their own problems. And yeah, so basically they need saving from the Norse and need the intervention of Norse practices to solve their problems. And unfortunately, this portrays the Norse as liberators rather than invaders. And also in actual history, well, the Danes and the Norse were curious about Christianity, and a lot of them started converting into these religions. However, the counterparts in the games seem to have no interest in this sort of in this religion, and in fact end up enforcing their ways upon the Saxons, which appears to improve their conditions. So this unfortunately has implications, which portrays Norse as a superior culture, and that's kind of problematic, which I'll be coming to in a bit. At the same time, there are depictions of friendly kings who are allies of, who are Saxons, but who are the allies of the Norse. Oswald is one of these examples. And for example, he's considered to be very weak because he's forgiving and does not like violence. He's considered to be a weak ruler and is not taken seriously by anyone, even his own Dane and Norse allies. However, by the end of his arc, basically in the story, he regains his honor. But the way he does so is problematic because the only way he can regain his honor is by a poor imitation of the Norse ways, rather than his own approach of, say, non-violence or sticking to Christianity. That was his major belief. So this shows that, again, once again, Norse is a superior culture. Another example of this would be, say, in world events, where these are small side missions that are present in the game, where there is the case of, well, this character called the Anchoress. She's taken a vow to stay in a church as a vow of isolation. But Eva basically tricks her into breaking that vow and shows her the outside world. And upon being enraptured by the beauty of the outside world, she decides to go explore it and give up on her ways. Now, well, while that might not seem so problematic, if I put it into a modern context, well, that is the equivalent of perhaps tempting a Buddhist monk to break their vows by offering them a life of decadence or to partake in sexual favors, etc. So that's like a serious problem. And most world events are in this game are ever solving Saxon problems with a sprinkle of, well, good old Norse knowledge and practices. Next, we move on to the removal of violence or the portrayal. So basically, there's this portrayal that raids do not harm the civilians, which does not make any sense. So places that the player will see in the game will desynchronize you that in this context of Assassin's Creed means that it produces a game over if your character kills civilians, including if while raiding a monastery you kill the monks. Now that is a huge reach because again the militarization of the kingdoms also meant that even the basic civilians and farmers were liable to be drafted into the army, and definitely civilians would have fought with the Vikings in actual history. So by removing this very fact, there is this sanitization that takes place because they do not want to show the Norse in a bad light as violent people. Also, desynchronization in the Assassin's Creed games also mean that the player has deviated from the actions of his predecessor, which again does not line up with historical sources. So while these factors alone are problematic, there are also broader implications to that in a larger global context. That is colonialization. So we move to some of the colonial concerns. Well, in this picture, we see Eivor and his clan basically attacking a church or a monastery, raiding them for its resources. It's also important to note that the England of this game is suspiciously both resource-rich and surprisingly empty. And well, the neighboring places where, say, they are sort of settling in, the places that neighbor them, the Saxons who live there, do not usually have a problem with the Vikings. In fact, they're very welcoming. So that's a bit confusing. The player's clan settles with a minimum of the player's clan settles with a minimum of us in occupied places, save for bandits who are just there as a game mechanic for you to level up, rather than being taken seriously. So it even shows that the resistance is minimal. And the player's clan basically takes up high value land directly on a river. That's prime real estate that one supposes the English just forgot about. I mean, technically there was already a Dane camp there. So the developers have done us the favor of having NPCs move in before us, violently clear the land of its local population and just leave it so that we can move peacefully. So that's how it appears to be. And hence the resulting settlement is, apart from some foreign merchants and specialists, entirely Norse. There is no subjugated or enslaved underclass, which when I touch back on the point of slavery, is impossible because the Saxons were made into slaves who were serving the Norse. So that's another aspect of sanitization that takes place. And while you might be opposed by Saxon soldiers in your raids, you don't need to kill any of the monks or farmers, and you cannot because desynchronization. So that's that. Instead, the early game missions generally represent the Norse and Danish invaders as a positive impact on the local population. We are told that this settlement was just a tiny village when the Daves moved in, but then they built it up into this big multicultural trading town, and all of the local English folks are just totally okay with it. And it's just some maybe mean, nasty Saxon army who's led by a bad guy, the member of an evil conspiracy. Those who are familiar with Assassin's Creed, about the Templars and the Assassins. So this bad guy person is the only one who's opposing this invasion, and that again it comes to like the problem of colonialization, because colonialism broadly is still a popular fantasy of colonialists about finding empty virgin lands to settle in, and this is still a major issue in the consciousness and politics of many countries. The way Valhalla has depicted this is that the lands in Valhalla are not only empty, but actively improved by being invaded and violently subjugated by superior people. That's modeled off an actual historical event. So that's just stunningly irresponsible storytelling. So, and especially if you look at this picture, when it talks about this mechanic called monastery raids.
Excuse me, Geoffrey, sorry to interrupt, but you're over your time limit. I will have to request you to kindly wrap up the presentation.
The next slide is just the conclusion. So when we look at this kind of supplies, it says that raiding these locations is the only way to get raw materials and the supplies to benefit your own settlement, which is kind of ironic because the whole area is surrounded by trees. So to get wood, you don't need to raid a monastery. And of course, we come to the also stuff that is linked to white supremacy, burning of churches. So that's just, again, problematic. And the discussion. So this is basically a few points initial observations that I've had about this, is that the game in creating this contrast between the Saxon society and this Danish and Norse society, while there's some history to this, there's a big overcorrection in how these, especially the Norse have been represented. And it just draws attention to how much they're going to change history to suit their narrative. And this depiction, well, is problematic because it's going to end up creating an overly romanticized view of Scandinavian society. At the same time, due to the sanitization, they end up propagating the white supremacy messages that they were so desperately trying to avoid. And this makes it appear as an apology for colonialism, as well as a Lebensraum of its own. And this opens up discussions to how overcorrections due to modern day hegemonic perceptions or countering them can lead to problematic representations. Also, at the same time, it's important to note how imposing one hegemonic culture's understanding of one culture over another is, well, again, problematic. And to end this, I would like also, Ubisoft has, say, for example, this disclaimer, right? So they have just basically gone completely against that. And this puts a burden on them. But it's a specific burden to have this when they have made such a game. And it's not that other games have not been, indulging in this Virgin Land fantasy. Minecraft, for example, is one of them. But they generally avoid putting this in a historical context. So, and focus on fictional fantasy worlds that might actually have empty lands. So to conclude, I would like to say, also point out to one specific incident in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, where the player is working as an Abstergo agent and is asked to review Edward Kenway's memories. The director of that program reviews the memories and tries to cut out the violence and slavery, trying to portray, pirates as villains. And there's this sense, it becomes like a sensationalized history piece. In that game, this was a criticism of how the history of the colonial subject is written. So it's kind of meta that this exact thing that they were criticizing in Black Flag is the real life model of how Valhalla has been constructed. So with this, there are some of the references that I've used. And with this, I would end the presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Geoffrey. A big thank you to all presenters for their fascinating presentations. I will now open the session to questions, comments, and feedback. First, let's go and check the chat box. Okay, so Ishan has already asked a question in the chat box, and I think this is addressed towards Anandadeep, where he asks, with respect to the keynote address yesterday, do you believe that the absurdity in Disco Elysium helps to decenter the protagonist and produce a game that is not so explicitly, quote unquote, about the player? And as a follow-up question, he asks, further, does this idea of waiting for Godot in the form of a video game that you mentioned deprive the player of the standard meaning of playing a game, completing a story, and fulfilling objectives? Would you like to address this, Anandadeep?
Yes, I would. First of all, thank you, Ishan, for pointing it out and your question. So yesterday when I was listening to the keynote, almost every other instance that Meg was talking about hit a note with me, because I was like, I've seen this. This is Disco Elysium. I've seen this. This is Disco Elysium. And so does absurdity help to decenter the protagonist? Yes. And also drawing from Poonam's and Zara's talk earlier in the day about ontology and ghosts and how that sort of plays into the game playing experience. I personally feel that Disco Elysium is a game that is very haunted by its ghosts. So as a protagonist, you are constantly decentered because you're unable to find out what is the originary point of the character you're playing. For instance, when you look back at the beginning, your character is amnesiac. You have no idea of who you are. So when you look back at what affected him, you discover that his girlfriend left him. And you look back and you discover that there was a childhood. And you look back and there's an entire history of the world that is influencing who he is now. And he is basically fractured, and he's shot through with history and with trauma, with violence, and that informs his character. And he, as a protagonist, is not whole. He is not a central protagonist. There is no unifying story to him. He's a fractured protagonist, and in that way, he is decentered, so to speak. But another point you've raised very correctly is that player satisfaction. So the question, of course, arises: what is it that satisfies the player in the game? yes, fulfilling objectives is a satisfaction, but the objectives themselves are so meaningless. For instance, one of the most satisfying objectives of the game that people talk about is singing karaoke, and in the game as the protagonist. And again, this has no impact on the story, but it is incredibly happy. It makes you incredibly happy as a player to see your character singing his heart out about a very sad song in the middle of the cafe. And now then the question arises, then does our satisfaction only comes from in conventional role-playing games acquiring money or shooting the colonized, shooting the colonized, and shooting the brown people, so to speak? The only place where but no, there's a different mode of satisfaction that you find in Disco Elysium. And that is what I find so interesting about this game, that it offers an alternative. As Meg said in her talk yesterday, she's more interested in the possibilities. And Disco Elysium is a game of possibilities. When you roll for that performance, there are two possibilities. You can either fail or you can win. In both cases, you sing a song, in one in a slightly different tone, in another in a slightly different tone. Both are arguably quite good. The game offers it a value, but you get the satisfaction of having both, and there's the possibility of a possible alternative performance that could have happened but did not happen. So in that, it sort of works out. I hope I've answered your question in my rambling way.
Right. Thank you, Anandadeep. We have another question from Ishan, and this is addressed to Geoffrey. So Ishan asks, with respect to the idea that the Norse are portrayed as saviors, while I understand it is not true, is it not true that certain Anglo-Saxon kings actually enlisted the help of the Norse invaders, hence giving them a foothold into the region, both physically and politically? Would you like to address this question, Geoffrey?
Well, that's absolutely true, because even in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, King Alfred the Great uses the Norse to do his bidding and then betrays them. So that's true that Anglo-Saxon kings are also not good. But what Valhalla does here is that it specifically focuses on first representing the Saxons in a bad light. But yes, we can claim that it's somewhat true. But it does not give the same treatment to the Norse, where they are portrayed exactly as saviors. Nothing is wrong with their policies. And as I also pointed out earlier, their intervention is in fact for the good of everyone. So your comment is true, but that specific point is again something that I'm still fleshing out. Maybe I can discuss that with you a little after a little more reading.
Right. Thank you, Geoffrey. Hirono Mukherjee has an observation which he says pertains to your presentation, Geoffrey. And he says that he thinks a lot of observations you made regarding Valhalla are also especially applicable to Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And just a few examples: sanitization of history pertaining to slavery, inaccurate portrayal of Spartans, inaccurate representation of gender roles. Cassandra participates in the Olympics in ancient Greece. So any comments on this?
Well, yeah, the part that Cassandra participates in the Olympics, well, it's incomprehensible that even Cassandra is allowed to be a mercenary, because that's just not plausible in their consciousness at that time. But of course, certain creative liberties have to be taken. Inclusivity is one of the, well, as we have seen today, why it's important. So there is reasoning for why certain steps should be taken, but again, Ubisoft falls into a trap because it sets it in actual historical settings, where others usually manage to get away by saying it's a fantasy and engagement or whatever. That's that. And well, if you're talking about historicity and accuracy, we also have like Adrian Shaw, who talks about Assassin's Creed 3, where she has gone even to say that, say, for example, the clan that the protagonist belongs to, that clan is now extinct. So when Ubisoft got voice actors to voice the character, they brought the people from another clan on a different, because they're, and even also an evolved form of that clan, which is supposed to be like a brother or sister clan to the original one. So these are some of the points she picks up, but at the same time, these are nitpickings compared to the kind of problematic representation that were there in Valhalla. So, I mean, yeah, if you want to go to different levels of authenticity, none of the Assassin's Creed games can be called that. There always has to be an element of fiction into that. So maybe that's it.
Right. Thank you, Geoffrey. Orithro has raised his hands. Orithro, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
My question is to Abhirup Maity on his paper of the colonization in the civilization kind of games. My question is, what would you think? What would you say about the game mechanics per se, and how they contribute into this idea of colonizing? The idea of how they tie into, sort of the verbs that the players use there pertain to colonization instead, because many of the times, because, and this is also a very important thing, the important conversation that is going on in these this genre, about how these games pander towards colonizing and imperialist tendencies, as Meghna Jayant also was speaking about yesterday, about the imperial pleasures in gaming. That is my question, that what is your take on the idea of it's not just India. There are also, even if because the games allow us colonization of other territories too, and that is what my question would be, that what is your take, or what is your interpretation of these game mechanics that are still sort of problematically relevant in this genre? Thank you.
Well, Abhirup, are you there? Would you like to take this question, Abhirup?
Shobik, I think Abhirup is not here. So
yes, it's unfortunate that Abhirup is not here. So I think you will have to wait for your answer, Orithro. You can ask him yourself later. Okay, so are there any other questions, any observations? If anybody would like to make them, you can just raise your hands. I will unmute you, and then you can ask or comment as per your wishes. Orithro, you still have your hands raised. Do you have any further comments to make? Right, okay. You just lowered your hand. All right. So any further comments, anybody?
I'm so sorry, I don't know how to raise my hands here, but I have a sort of, not really a comment, but a question, if you will, for Geoffrey.
Sure.
My question is that, so this basically goes off on what Meg is saying, and the kind of, again, what Meg said yesterday and what you said today about history and hegemony, and the colonial fantasy of video games, and how that is something we keep on seeing repeatedly. So my question is a slightly disturbing one, which is that what does that say to us as an audience, really? As somebody who consumes video games, we still spend enormous amounts of money in buying them, and specifically this kind of games that gives this kind of colonial satisfaction. So I find myself questioning that, what does it say to us as an audience who enjoys this kind of game, and perhaps how can you reimagine them in a way that the colonial, we read the colonial experience with empathy. Your reading was very correct, and I find it very very accurate that you pointed out the feminization of the Saxons, and the over masculinization of the Vikings, so to speak. So my question, of course, is that it's not really a question, but an observation, so to speak, is that what does it say to us as an audience who consume these games, and how perhaps can we imagine an alternative? And if we can imagine an alternative like this, how can it be marketed? It's just me rambling, basically.
Well, basically, if you put it that way, because these are historical settings, Ubisoft actually has the free license to show it as it is. If they showed, say, for example, the Saxons engaging in violence, that would be a more realistic representation, right? And I think this very factor that companies have to feed people opinions, right? That you have to see it in this certain way is very wrong, because it takes away. I think it was yesterday someone was talking about ethics, and there was this fact that, like, I had put forward the question that even like desynchronization in Assassin's Creed does not let you take unethical actions. So that takes away the agency from the players. At the same time, this should also be given, the agency to make their own opinions should also be given to players. So perhaps that's one of the steps that can be taken. Second, you talked about, well, overt masculinity and these kind of things. One other thing that I noticed while playing Valhalla is that while the character, well, the protagonist can also be chosen as well to be a female, but it's like the saying that manly societies give rise to manly men as well as manly women, and at the same time, the Saxons have been portrayed as feminine damsels in distress, and there is like they are well lambasted for being in that sort of way. So basically, those are feminine qualities, even though they're applied to men, they're lambasted for it. So I would say that this again is a disguised form of misogyny rather than being a movement that is, rather than being female empowerment as such. So, well, companies need to be little, as Sarah again pointed that, well, Naughty Dog had really good advisors who talked about this. So maybe that is one area where is something someone like Ubisoft can invest in, because these kind of representations do affect how people would see societies. Because we are scholars, we feel like we should go and read up on history. Normal people will not do that. They will see it as exactly as it's told, and they will form their perceptions about it. So that should be one of the, especially for Assassin's Creed, where they say historicity is one of their biggest, focuses. That's a very misleading statement at this point. So that's something maybe they should look into.
Right. Thank you. Well, I see that Abhirup has just entered the meeting, but for some technical problems, probably he is still on mute. We will just give him 1 minute or so to see if that can be resolved soon, and then we can have that discussion between Abhirup and Orithro as we were supposed to. Can you hear us, Abhirup?
Shobhik, I think Abhirup could type his response in the chat box if he is unable to, because I think he is having problems with his internet.
Yes, I figured so.
Again,
if Orithro,
the question of digital divide comes in, really, in the global south.
Yes, exactly. So Orithro, if you could just type out your question, or if you could just, speak.
I'll just quickly ask the question, and you can reply. My question to you was that since you pointed out the question of colonialism that has come up in the games and in the strategy games, that strategy 4X genre blending games that you took up. My question was that what would be your interpretation of because to set up the context would be that recently there has been discussions about how this genre tends to be the mechanics in this genre tends to get very much pandering to imperial pleasures, as Meg quoted last day, in the sense that it always tends to be surrounded by, tends to be around colonizing one in one way or other. My question would be that what was your interpretation of how these mechanics reinforce the idea of colonizing the other, and how it also helps further the topics that you were talking about of Gandhi and how India was represented in the sense of basically my question would be your interpretation of these specific kinds of mechanics that are found recurrently in these sorts of games. That is all.
Right, thank you. Abhirup, you could just type out your answer in the chat box and I'll read it out for the audience.
First of all, let us know if you can hear us, because just type in the chat if you can hear us, Abhirup. Okay. I don't think he's able to hear us either. So,
Right. Well, there seems to be technical difficulties right now. So that's really unfortunate. But well, this is also a part of our conference, right? Because doing this conference in a from the global south itself is, as Professor Mukherjee had already said right at the beginning, is something of a challenge as well as an achievement. And well, we will have to grapple with these issues as we move on. But well, I will encourage Orithro and Abhirup to sort of discuss this between themselves, probably fortunately on a later time. But well, as of now, since we are nearing the end of our session, well, I will have to say that this brings our session to an end. I would like to thank all the participants for the wonderful discussion and the fascinating session. We will now go into a lunch break and resume from 3 p.m. hopefully. And we hope to see you there for the final panel of the conference. Thank you so much.
thank you so much, Shobik, for chairing this session. See you at 3 p.m. I would request all the members, all the organizers to please join 15 minutes at like 2:45 or maybe 2:50. 2:50 should be good. Yeah.